Long before streets became the veins of human life, one ancient settlement seems to have turned the idea of a city upside down. Instead of walking between houses, people lived in packed rooms pressed wall to wall, with movement rising above the ground, across roofs, ladders, smoke holes, and shared surfaces. The cold truth is that the first large human communities did not always look like the cities we inherited. So 9,000 years ago, why did humans build a city with no streets where everyone entered through the roof? When we hear the word city, the mind draws a picture before we have time to question it. We see streets, doors, corners, open paths, and people moving at ground level from one building to another. A city, in the modern imagination, is almost impossible to separate from the idea of streets. Streets divide private life from public life. Streets tell the body where to walk, where to stop, where to turn, and where one home ends before another begins. Yet about 9,000 years ago, on the plains of central Anatolia, an ancient settlement seems to have asked a different question. What if a large human community did not begin with roads at all? What if the houses were packed so closely together that the usual space between them almost disappeared? What if people moved across the roofs, then entered their homes from above, climbing down into rooms where fire, food, sleeping, work, and family memory were held in one quiet interior? This is the first reason the streetless city feels so strange. It does not simply look different from a modern city. It reverses the way our bodies imagine daily life. For us, the door is on the side. The path is outside. The roof is overhead, separate from movement, almost silent unless rain or wind touches it. In that older settlement, the roof may have been much more than shelter. It may have been a surface of travel, a shared open layer above the rooms, a place where movement happened in sunlight while private life stayed below. A person returning home may not have walked along a lane and pushed open a front door. The route may have led over packed roof surfaces, toward an opening, and then downward by ladder into the darker warmth of the house. The home was not beside the path. The home was under the path. That single change makes the ancient settlement more than a curiosity. It shows that early crowded life did not have to follow the shape that later cities would make familiar. Long before paved roads, markets, written signs, or public squares, human beings were already testing how close they could live to one another without becoming scattered again. The answer was not fixed. It had to be made from mudbrick, wood, plaster, smoke, storage, habit, and the repeated needs of the body. People needed warmth. They needed places to cook. They needed dry surfaces to sleep on. They needed storage for food and tools. They needed some way to move between homes without turning the settlement into the open, street-based world we know now. For most of human history, our ancestors lived in smaller, more mobile groups. They followed animals, plants, water, seasons, and safer ground. Their shelters could be temporary. Their paths were not built into permanent walls. The body was used to open distance, to horizons, to moving when the land required movement. A roof-entered settlement belongs to a later threshold, when some communities were no longer only passing through a landscape. They were staying, returning, repairing, rebuilding, and letting life accumulate in the same place. This is why the absence of streets matters so much. It is not just an empty space on an archaeological plan. It is a clue that the beginning of settled life was not a smooth line toward the modern city. It was a set of experiments, some of them quiet and unfamiliar, where people learned to live with neighbors pressed close enough to share walls, smoke, sound, and roof lines. The cold truth is that the city may have begun before the street became its spine. It may have begun when human beings accepted a stranger arrangement, to live below the paths they walked, to sleep beneath the surface others crossed, and to turn the roof itself into the threshold between the human body, the crowded home, and the open sky. To understand a settlement without streets, it helps to begin with the ground. In the cities we know, the ground is the first map. Roads lie on it, doorways open onto it. Good. Feet trust it. A child learns the world by stepping out from a room into a path that already tells the body where it may go. But in this ancient roof-entered settlement, the ground seems to have lost part of that familiar role. It was still earth, still the base beneath the houses, still the place where walls rose and floors were laid. Yet it was not necessarily the main surface of public movement. The roofs appear to have carried a quieter kind of circulation, a second ground lifted above the rooms. That is the reversal at the heart of the title. The street was not missing because people had no sense of movement. Movement had been shifted upward. Imagine a dense mass of mud-brick houses, their outer walls touching or nearly touching, their flat roofs forming a broken but usable surface under the open sky. Instead of walking through lanes between buildings, a person may have crossed from roof to roof, using ladders and openings to descend into particular homes. The path was not a carved line between houses. It was spread across the tops of houses. This matters because it changes how space was felt by the human body. A street gives distance before entry. It lets people approach a doorway from outside, pause, turn, watch others pass, and stand between private and shared life. A roof route creates a different rhythm. The body rises, crosses, bends, lowers itself down. Entry becomes vertical. The home is reached from above, not from the side. Light comes from the roof. Smoke leaves through the roof. The same opening may connect air, fire, movement, and the boundary between inside and outside. Nothing about this requires us to imagine a strange or impossible people. It requires only that we stop forcing later urban habits onto an earlier world. Near the beginning of settled life, humans were still learning what a permanent community could be. For countless generations before farming villages and large settlements, people had lived with landscapes more than with walls. Paths were made by walking. Camp edges shifted. Shelter could be repaired, abandoned, or moved. The human body knew open land, changing seasons, and the wide logic of animals, plants, water, and weather. A streetless settlement belongs to a different experiment. Here, movement no longer followed only rivers, ridges, trails, and animal paths. It had to pass through a human-made surface built over repeated domestic life. Roofs, in that sense, were not merely architecture. They were a new kind of terrain. They allowed people to stay close while still moving through the community. They made density possible without copying the later pattern of streets. They also blurred categories that modern people often keep separate. The roof could be shelter, path, working surface, meeting surface, and entrance. The house below could be private, but the route above may have been shared. The sky was open, yet the rooms beneath were enclosed. A person could be outdoors while standing on top of another person's indoor world. That creates a social arrangement very different from a street lined with separate doors. It asks us to imagine neighbours not as people across the road, but as people above, beside, and below one another. Sound, smoke, smell, heat, and movement would have travelled in ways that are difficult for a modern apartment or village street to fully explain. Still, the archaeological traces do not allow us to claim every detail with certainty. We can say that many houses were tightly packed, that roof access is widely accepted as an important feature, and that clear street systems like those of later cities are not what define this place. We should not pretend to hear exact conversations on those roofs, or to know exactly how every person felt while crossing them, but the physical arrangement itself is enough to challenge the imagination. It shows that one early path toward dense human living did not begin by drawing lines through the ground. It began by stacking movement above domestic rooms, letting daily life rise onto the roof, and turning the surface meant to cover the home into the surface that connected the community. The deepest surprise of a streetless settlement is not that it looks unusual from above, it is that it quietly breaks one of the strongest assumptions modern people carry about civilization. We often imagine human progress as a line moving from open camps to villages, from villages to streets, from streets to cities, and from cities to the crowded world we know now. In that picture, the street seems almost natural, as if people must have invented it the moment they began living close together. But the ancient roof-entered settlement asks us to pause before that assumption. It suggests that crowded life could form around a different logic, one where the first need was not to carve open roads between houses, but to bind houses into a dense human surface. The shock is not loud, it is slow. It comes from realizing that a community could become large, stable, and complex without arranging itself around the public pathways later people would treat as obvious. For a long time, our ancestors did not need streets because they did not live inside permanent crowds. Human beginnings were shaped by movement, by small groups, by temporary shelters, by paths that followed water, animals, edible plants, firewood, and seasonal safety. The earliest human maps were not drawn through blocks of buildings. They were carried in memory, in the body, in repeated journeys across land. A footpath could fade. A camp could shift. A shelter could be left behind. Dense settlement changed that relationship. When many people remained in one place, space had to be managed differently. Food had to be stored. Fire had to be controlled. Waste had to be handled. Neighbours had to live close enough to share a settlement, but not so close that daily life became impossible. Later cities solved much of this with streets, courtyards, gates, drainage, and planned divisions. Yet this ancient place shows another kind of solution, older and less familiar. The houses pressed together. The roots rose upward. The roofs became part of the settlement's working skin. To the modern mind, this can feel like a missing step. But perhaps it was not missing at all. Perhaps it belonged to a different stage of human adaptation, when people were learning to live not simply near one another, but physically against one another. Wall beside wall, roof beside roof, hearth below opening, ladder between sky and room. Such an arrangement would have shaped every quiet act of the body. Leaving home meant rising. Entering home meant descending. The line between outside and inside was not a doorway facing a lane, but an opening in the surface above the room. The body had to remember heights, edges, smoke, roof texture, and the nearness of other households. This does not mean the people were strange in mind, or that their world was unknowable in a mystical way. It means their built environment trained ordinary human senses differently. The eyes would search for roof lines and openings instead of streets and doors. The hands would know ladders. The feet would learn packed roof surfaces. The lungs would know hearth smoke moving upward. The ears would hear life not only across open space, but through walls, over roofs, and from rooms below. That is why the site matters for the history of human settlement. It gives us a rare chance to see that the city did not begin as one fixed idea. It was not born complete, with streets already waiting to organize human life. It emerged from many experiments in closeness. Some would disappear, some would lead toward later village forms. Some would become buried in layers of earth, leaving only walls, floors, roof openings, and traces of fire for archaeologists to read. The lesson is not that streets were unnecessary everywhere, or that roof entry was the universal beginning of urban life. That would be too simple. The quieter lesson is that humans have repeatedly learned to live together by reshaping the basic relationship between body and space. In one ancient settlement, the answer was not a road. It was a roof. And once we understand that, the title becomes more than a historical oddity. It becomes a question about the deep flexibility of our species. Before cities became streets, how many other ways did humans try to become a community? The world around this roof-entered settlement was not an empty background. It helped shape the houses, the movement, and the strange absence of streets. On the plains of central Anatolia, people were living in a landscape where earth itself could become architecture. Mud, clay, reeds, timber, grasses, and plaster were not merely materials. They were the language through which settled life could be made. A stone city would have demanded a different world. A forest city would have carried another rhythm. But a mudbrick settlement belonged to land that could be cut, mixed, shaped, dried, repaired, and rebuilt. Its walls did not have to stand forever in the way later monuments tried to stand forever. They could be renewed, patched, replastered, buried, and built over again. This matters because a streetless plan is easier to understand when we imagine houses not as isolated objects, but as cells in a thick earthen body. If walls are made from similar materials, if roofs are flat enough to be worked and crossed, and if the settlement grows by adding rooms close to existing rooms, then open lanes may not become the first solution. The houses could press together because the material world allowed them to press together. The same earth beneath the feet became the wall beside the body and the roof above the hearth. In that sense, the settlement was not built against the landscape. It was partly made from the landscape itself. This returns us to a deeper human beginning. For most of our species past, shelter was a negotiation with what a place offered. Branches, hides, stone overhangs, grasses, bones, earth, and fire. Early humans did not begin with abstract designs. They began with weather, hunger, darkness, heat, cold, and the need to keep the body alive through the night. Even when some communities began to settle, that older relationship did not disappear. The roof-entered city still carried the memory of a body asking basic questions. Where can warmth be held? Where can food be stored? Where can children sleep away from wind and dust? Where can smoke escape without leaving the room open to every change in the weather? These questions are not dramatic, but they are the foundation of human architecture. A house grows first from vulnerability, not from beauty. The climate and seasons around the settlement would have shaped how people handled heat, cold, light, dryness, mud, fuel, and ventilation. Flat roofs could become useful surfaces in a dry enough environment, though they still required care. Mudbrick walls could hold warmth and create enclosed interiors, but they also needed maintenance. Plastered floors and walls could be renewed again and again, making the house feel less like a finished object and more like a living surface. If people entered from above, the roof opening could do several things at once. It could be a way in. It could be a way for smoke to leave. It could bring light into an interior that had few or no side windows facing a street. It could connect the hidden room to the wide sky. The same opening, then, belonged to movement, air, fire, and vision. This is why the environment cannot be separated from the mystery. The settlement was not simply a strange plan invented in the mind. It was a practical answer formed through the materials and limits of a particular place. When houses stand close together, their outer walls can protect one another. When roots move across roofs, the upper surface becomes part of daily space. When walls, floors, and roofs come from earth, the whole settlement can thicken over generations like a human-made layer of landscape. Still, we should remain careful. Archaeology can show walls, floors, hearths, ladders, roof access, and dense building patterns, but it cannot tell us every reason with complete certainty. The safest understanding is quieter and more useful. In this ancient community, the environment, the body, and the available materials work together to produce a form of life that did not need streets in the familiar sense. The city without streets was not floating outside nature. It rose slowly from mud, weather, fuel, repair, and the old human need to turn a difficult landscape into a place where many people could remain. Before people could build a settlement like this, they first had to cross a much older boundary in human life. For most of our deep past, staying in one place was not the normal condition. Human groups moved because food moved, water changed, animals migrated, plants ripened in different seasons, and safety could shift with weather, darkness, hunger, and other living beings. A shelter was important, but it did not always have to become a permanent center of the world. It could be repaired for a season, left behind, or remembered as one stop within a wider landscape. The body learned distance. Feet learned paths that were not marked by walls. Eyes learned slopes, watercourses, animal trails, tree lines, smoke, and the changing color of the ground. Memory held the map more than architecture did. A roof-entered settlement belongs to a different kind of human decision. It shows a world where some people were no longer only moving through land, but beginning to let land hold them in return. This did not mean that life became easy, or that movement disappeared. People still needed fields, gathered foods, animals, fuel, clay, water, and materials from the surrounding landscape. But the center of gravity had changed. Instead of shelter following the group increasingly returned to shelter. Instead of the path being the main structure of life, the house became a repeated point of return. This is one of the quietest revolutions in human history. It was not a single invention like a tool picked up in the hand. It was a slow rearrangement of daily life around storage, hearths, walls, roofs, and repeated repair. Once food could be produced or gathered in more predictable ways, once certain places could support longer residence, the human body faced a new problem. How do many people remain together without the old freedom of distance? In a mobile world, tension could sometimes be answered by movement. A group could spread out, shift camp, follow another valley, or change its seasonal route. In a dense settlement, bodies remain near one another longer. Smoke, sound, smell, illness, work, food, tools, children, animals, and waste all become shared problems of place. This is where the absence of streets becomes more meaningful. It may show an early solution to settled closeness before the later grammar of urban planning had fully appeared. The settlement did not need to look like a city of roads because it was answering an older question: how can people stay, build, store, cook, sleep, and return again and again without scattering back into open land? The roofs offered one possible answer. They created an upper layer of movement while the rooms below held domestic life. They allowed houses to sit tightly together, perhaps preserving warmth, space, and continuity, while still giving people ways to cross the settlement. This makes the roof-entered city feel less like an architectural oddity and more like a record of transition. It stands between the older human world of open movement and the later world of organized streets. It was not simply wild life becoming civilized life. That is too simple and too confident. It was a long period of adjustment, where human beings brought old bodies into new arrangements. The legs that once followed animal tracks now climbed ladders into roof openings. The hands that once repaired temporary shelters now maintained plastered walls and packed roofs. The eyes that once read distant landforms now also read the edges of neighbouring homes. The mind that once carried roots across open country now had to remember rooms, hearths, storage places, and family spaces built over older floors. In this way, the settlement holds a memory of both worlds. It still depended on the wider environment, but it also thickened into a human-made place. It still belonged to the deep history of wandering bodies, but it asked those bodies to become more settled, more repetitive, more enclosed, and more tolerant of nearness. That is why the move from travelling life to roof-entered life should not be treated as a simple step forward. Something was gained: stored food, durable homes, repeated community, and a stronger attachment to place. Something may also have been lost: open distance, flexible escape, and the older ease of spreading across land when pressure grew too heavy. The streetless settlement sits quietly inside that exchange. It reminds us that early settled life was not only about building houses, it was about teaching an ancient moving body how to live under roofs, over roofs, beside other roofs, and within a place that could no longer be folded up and carried away. A roof can seem ordinary only when we forget what it does. In modern life, the roof is usually above us, silent, unreachable, and separate from daily movement. It protects the room but rarely belongs to the path. We do not normally greet neighbours on the roof, enter through the roof, or think of the roof as part of the street. Yet in this ancient settlement, the roof appears to have carried a much larger role. It was not only a cover against weather, it may have been a working surface, a route, a threshold, and a shared layer of life above the enclosed rooms. That idea changes the whole settlement. If the houses stood close together, and if their flat upper surfaces could be crossed, then the roofs became a kind of raised landscape made by human hands. They were neither fully private nor fully public in the way a modern sidewalk is public. They belonged to the houses below, but they also connected those houses to one another. A person standing on a roof could be outside, under the sky, while also standing directly over a domestic interior. The body was exposed to light and air, yet only a few steps from an opening leading down into warmth, smoke, stored food, sleeping places, and family space. This kind of arrangement reminds us that early settled life did not separate functions as sharply as later cities would. A street was for movement, a house was for living, a roof was for shelter. Those categories feel natural now because we inherited them. In the roof-entered settlement, one surface could carry several meanings at once. The roof could support walking, it could dry materials, it could receive sunlight, it could allow smoke to escape through openings nearby. It could become a place where the settlement breathed. It could also make crowding more manageable by lifting movement away from the dense mass of walls below. This was not simply a clever design. It was a physical answer to the deeper human problem of staying. Our ancestors began as bodies adapted to change, distance, and open land. The earliest shelters did not need to hold generations in one place. They needed to protect people for a time. But when communities began to remain longer, the surfaces around the body had to do more. Floors had to be maintained, walls had to hold, roofs had to be repaired, openings had to admit light and release smoke. Movement had to pass through a place that was becoming thicker with human life. In that setting, the roof could become a second ground, not by theory, but by repetition. Feet crossed it, hands repaired it, ladders connected it. Children may have learned its edges and openings as naturally as a modern child learns a doorway or step. Still, it is important not to pretend we know every detail of roof life. Archaeology gives traces, not a living day replayed from the past. We can see patterns of tightly packed houses, roof access, hearths, floors and openings, but we cannot safely invent every conversation, every custom, or every feeling. What we can say is more careful and more powerful. The built form itself suggests that the roof was part of how this community moved and lived. It was a surface where architecture and daily habit met. It turned the top of the house into a passage between the sky and the room, between shared movement and private life, between the open world above and the sheltered world below. That is why the title's question keeps deepening. A city with no streets was not necessarily a city with no pathways. Its pathways may have been lifted, spread out, softened, and woven into the houses themselves. The ancient roof was not just the end of the building, it was the beginning of another human surface, a place where settled life rose upward because the ground between homes had almost disappeared. Inside the roof-entered settlement, the house was not a simple container for sleep. It was the center where many layers of life met in a small enclosed space. A modern person often divides the day across many places: a kitchen for cooking, a bedroom for sleeping, a street for movement, a workplace for labor, a cemetery for the dead, and a public square or road for meeting others. In the ancient settlement, those divisions appear to have been much softer. The house held fire, food, tools, storage, resting places, and traces of repeated care. It was not merely where people returned after life happened elsewhere. Much of life happened inside it, under the same roof that also connected the settlement above. This makes the entrance from the roof more meaningful. A person climbing down into the house was not simply entering a room. They were descending into a small world organized around heat, smoke, floor, wall, ladder, and memory. The hearth mattered because fire changed the human relationship with night, cold, food, and safety long before any settlement grew dense. For ancient moving groups, fire had already been a center of warmth and attention. It softened food, held darkness back, gathered bodies, and gave a camp a temporary heart. In a settled house, that older human center became fixed in place. The fire no longer belonged only to a night camp that might be left behind. It belonged to a floor that could be swept, repaired, replastered, and used again. The smoke from that fire had to rise somewhere. Light had to enter somehow. Air had to move through a room that did not open onto a street with a normal front door. The roof opening, then, was not a decorative feature. It may have helped connect flame below with sky above. It may have joined movement, air, light, and heat in one vertical line. The ladder beside it would have been one of the most important objects in daily life, because it linked the shared upper surface to the domestic interior below. Each descent into the house would have reminded the body that home was not entered sideways, it was entered downward. The floor also carried meaning. In a mobile life, the ground beneath a shelter could be used for a while, and then left to weather, animals, plants, and time. In a more permanent home, the floor became a surface of repetition. Feet crossed it day after day, food was prepared near it, people rested on or near it. Tools were placed, lifted, lost, and found again. The floor could be renewed with plaster, made smooth, repaired when worn, and marked by the traces of ordinary domestic life. Walls could also be replastered, creating layers that quietly recorded maintenance. The house was therefore not a finished object frozen in one moment. It was something kept alive by human hands. This is important for understanding why a settlement without streets could still be socially dense. If the house was such a powerful center, then public life did not need to be arranged around streets in the way later cities were. The settlement could be made from many strong domestic centers placed tightly together, each with its own hearth, floors, platforms, storage spaces, and roof entrance. From above, the roofs connected these centers. From below, the rooms held the repeated needs of the body. This arrangement also reminds us to be careful. Archaeology can show hearths, plastered surfaces, storage traces, platforms, ladders, and dense walls, but it cannot give us every private meaning the people attached to these spaces. We should not pretend to know exactly what they thought when they sat by a fire, repaired a wall, or climbed down from a roof. The evidence is enough. Without pretending, it shows that the ancient house was not passive. It gathered the basic problems that followed humans from their earliest beginnings: warmth, food, shelter, sleep, light, air, nearness, and continuity. In a streetless settlement, the house became the unit from which the wider community was made. Not streets first, then houses. Not public roads first, then private rooms. Here, the rooms themselves seem to have pressed together until the settlement became a thick fabric of domestic life, with the roof above acting like the quiet surface that held it all together. A house becomes different when it holds more than the living moment. In this ancient roof-entered settlement, the home appears to have gathered food, warmth, tools, daily work, and traces of the dead within the same enclosed world. That does not mean every house was identical, or that every household lived in the same way. Archaeology rarely gives that kind of certainty, but the physical traces suggest that the house was more than a shelter used and forgotten. It was a place where repeated life left layers. Floors were renewed, walls were replastered, hearths were used again and again. Storage areas helped hold food and materials. In some homes, human remains were placed beneath floors or platforms, reminding us that the boundary between domestic life and ancestral memory may have been very different from the one most modern people inherit. Today, we often separate the dead from the living. We place memory in special places, away from cooking smoke, sleeping bodies, and ordinary rooms. In that older settlement, some traces suggest a world where family space, bodily presence, and long memory could remain close together. It would be wrong to claim we know exactly what those burials meant to the people who made them. We cannot safely put modern words into ancient minds, yet the location itself is powerful. A floor is not a distant monument. It is something people live upon. It is crossed by feet, warmed by bodies, swept by hands, and repaired through time. If the dead were placed beneath such surfaces in certain homes, then memory may not have been kept outside the house. It may have rested below daily life, quiet and near. This brings us back to the older beginning of human beings. Long before large settlements, humans carried memory through movement. A camp might be left behind, but stories, scars, tools, kinship, and remembered places travelled with the group. The dead could be mourned in ways that left little trace, because time, animals, weather, and distance erase many forms of grief. When people began to stay in one place, memory could become attached to surfaces. A floor could hold more than weight. A wall could hold more than shelter. A house could become a repeated container of generations. That is why the streetless city cannot be understood only by looking at its roofs. We also have to imagine the downward depth of the home. Above, people may have moved across roofs. Below, rooms held fire, food, bodies, and memory. The settlement was not just spread across space. It was layered through time. Each repaired surface added a little more human presence to the same place. Each rebuilt wall made the old ground less like open landscape and more like inherited ground. Food storage also changed the meaning of the house. For mobile ancestors, food was often tied to movement, season, and immediate need. To store food in a settled home is to make a quiet promise to the future. It means tomorrow has entered the room. It means the house is not only protecting the body tonight, but also holding something for later hunger. Stored food can bring security, but it also brings responsibility. It has to be protected from damp, pests, theft, spoilage, and loss. In a dense settlement, food inside the home may have made the house feel even more central, because survival was no longer only out in the wider land. Some of it sat within walls, near hearths, beneath roofs, in places that had to be watched, maintained, and remembered. This helps explain why streets were not the only possible centre of early community life. Later cities often used streets to organise trade, movement, power, and public identity. But here, the house itself may have carried much of the weight. It held the living body. It protected stored resources. It kept traces of those who came before. It connected the present day to older surfaces below. The result is a settlement that feels almost inside out. The shared roots were above, while the deepest meanings may have rested below. A roof could connect one home to another, but the floor could connect one generation to another. In that quiet vertical arrangement, we begin to see why entering through the roof was more than an unusual way to come home. It was a descent into a small human world where food, fire, sleep, memory, and the long experiment of staying in one place were gathered together. If the house held fire, food, sleep, work, and memory, then the settlement did not need streets to become meaningful. Its center was not a broad road cutting through the community, but many enclosed rooms pressed together, each one carrying the weight of daily survival. This is difficult for a modern mind because our cities teach us to think from the outside inward. We name places by their streets. We find homes by their addresses. We imagine public life beginning beyond the front door. But in this ancient roof-entered settlement, the order seems different. The house came first as the deep unit of life, and the wider community formed from the contact between houses. A wall did not simply separate one family from another. It also allowed them to remain close enough for the settlement to thicken. A roof did not simply cover a room. It could connect one domestic centre to the next. A ladder did not simply solve the problem of entry. It joined the shared world above to the private world below. When we look at it this way, the absence of streets becomes less like a lack and more like a clue. These people were not failing to build a city properly. They were living within a different grammar of settlement, one in which the house carried many of the roles that streets would later divide and organize. This reaches back to the oldest human problem of shelter. Long before permanent houses, the center of a group was often the place where bodies gathered for warmth, food, sleep, and protection. A fire in a camp did not need a street leading to it. People knew where it was because life gathered around it. In a settled house, that older center became fixed in earth and plaster. The hearth, the floor, the stored food, and the sleeping area did not move with the season in the same way a camp might move. They remained, and because they remained, the human body began to build routines around them. Morning and night, hunger and rest, cleaning and repair, descent and ascent all return to the same small interior. A street-based city spreads life outward, across lanes and public spaces. A house-centered settlement gathers life inward, then connects it upward through roofs. Neither form is automatically more advanced. They answer different problems at different moments in human history. In a community of tightly packed houses, the roof could carry movement, while the room below carried continuity. The roof was the surface of crossing. The house was the chamber of return. This arrangement also changes how we imagine social life. A modern street lets people meet face to face at ground level, with doors opening toward a shared path. In the roof-entered settlement, contact may have been shaped by roof lines, openings, ladders, smoke, and the nearness of walls. Neighbours were not simply across the road, they were beside, above, and sometimes almost woven into the same built surface. That closeness must be treated carefully. It does not prove a peaceful world, or a fearful world, or a hidden belief system. The evidence cannot carry those claims by itself, but it does show a pattern of living in which the domestic unit was powerful enough to shape the whole community. For people whose ancestors had spent most of human time in more open and mobile landscapes, this would have been a profound rearrangement of the body's world. The path no longer began in the distance. It began on the roof. The threshold no longer faced a street. It opened downward. The house was not one stop along a road. It was the main structure through which food, fire, sleep, memory, and neighbourly closeness became settled life. Perhaps that is why this ancient place still feels so strange. It reminds us that a city does not begin only when people build streets. It can begin when enough homes become so important, so repeated, and so close together that the spaces between them disappear. To live in a roof-entered settlement, the human body had to learn a different grammar of movement. In a modern street, movement is mostly horizontal. The feet step forward, the eyes look along a path, the hand reaches for a door at body height. The whole arrangement tells us that entry belongs to the side of a building. But in this ancient community, the body may have met home through climbing, balancing, bending, lowering, and descending. The route into the house did not simply lead across the ground. It moved upward onto the roof, then downward into the room. A person had to read edges, openings, roof surfaces, and ladders as carefully as a modern person reads curbs, doorways, and staircases. This was not a minor difference. Built space teaches the body what feels normal. A child growing up there may have learned early that the roof was not forbidden space above the house, but part of the lived world. The opening in the roof was not a danger in the abstract. It was the known threshold between outside air and the room below. The ladder was not a special object used occasionally. It may have been part of the daily rhythm of returning, leaving, carrying, reaching, and lowering the body into shelter. Such movement reaches back to much older human abilities. Before permanent houses, our ancestors moved through uneven land, over stones, across slopes, through brush, along riverbanks, and around obstacles that no builder had planned. The human body did not evolve for flat pavement and level corridors. It evolved with balance, grasping, bending, carrying, squatting, climbing, and adjusting to surfaces under the feet. A roof-entered settlement did not invent those abilities, but it redirected them into architecture. The old body of the moving human was now being asked to move through a dense human-made landscape. The slope was replaced by the ladder. The animal path was replaced by the roofline. The temporary shelter edge became a built opening above a room. This makes the settlement feel like a bridge between deep human movement and settled domestic life. Every descent into a house was also a reminder that the body was now living in a world made by other bodies. Walls pressed close, roofs touched, or nearly touched. Movement passed across surfaces that covered other interiors. The feet were not only crossing earth, they were crossing the upper skin of human homes. That would have changed how weight, caution, and awareness were experienced. Carrying food, tools, fuel, or a sleeping child through such a place would not feel the same as walking along a street. The body would need to know when to step, where to pause, how to turn near an opening, how to climb down without spilling what was carried, and how to enter a dimmer interior from the brightness above. Light, smoke, and temperature would also guide movement. The roof belonged to sun, wind, dust, and open air. The room below belonged to hearth warmth, stored things, shadow, plastered surfaces, and the enclosed smell of domestic life. Moving between them meant moving between two physical worlds. Again, we should not pretend to know every habit or feeling. The bones and walls do not speak in complete sentences, yet the arrangement itself is enough to show that daily life trained a different body from the one shaped by sidewalks and front doors. This ancient settlement asks us to imagine civilization not first as straight roads and smooth entrances, but as a patient retraining of older human movement. The same species that once crossed open landscapes began to cross roofs. The same hands that once held branches, stones, hides, and tools began to hold ladders, roof edges, and household loads. The same feet that once followed seasonal ground began to memorize a raised surface made from mudbrick and repair. In that quiet change, the city without streets becomes a history of the body itself, not only where humans lived, but how they learned to move when home was below the path. The eyes, lungs, skin, and hands would have known this streetless settlement in ways that a map can never fully show. From above, the roofs may look like a pattern of joined rectangles, walls, and openings. From inside the body, the same place would have been a changing field of light, heat, dust, smoke, and touch. A person crossing the roof in daylight would feel the open air first. The sky would be close. Sun, wind, and seasonal dryness would meet the skin. The surface under the feet would not be modern pavement, but a maintained roof made from earth, reeds, timber, plaster, and repair. It may have held warmth in one season and dust in another. It may have needed care after weather, use, and age. The body would learn it through repetition, not through written plans. Then, at the roof opening, the world would change. The eyes would move from brightness into a dimmer interior. The hands might find the ladder, the legs would bend. The body would descend from air into enclosure, from public or shared roof space into the protected room below. Inside, the senses would meet a different environment. Hearth smoke was not an abstract detail. It would have touched the eyes and lungs. Fire gave warmth and cooked food, but it also filled rooms with the problem of smoke, soot, and air. Roof openings could help release it, yet enclosed houses with hearths would still have carried smells and traces that modern people, with chimneys, windows, fans, and separate kitchens, rarely understand. The skin would feel warmth near the hearth and cooler air farther away. The eyes would adjust to low light. The nose would know fuel, clay, stored food, bodies, plaster, ash and dust. The ears would hear nearby households not through streets but through walls, roof surfaces and openings. This was not a clean separation between inside and outside. It was a slow exchange between them. Light came down. Smoke rose up. People descended and climbed out. Air moved through the same vertical relationship that made entry possible. This connects the settlement to a much older human beginning. Long before permanent rooms, human bodies had already lived with smoke, firelight, animal smells, damp ground, cold wind, and the rough textures of shelter. Our species did not begin in sealed, silent spaces. It began with bodies exposed to weather and dependent on small zones of protection. What changed in a roof-entered settlement was not the basic need for warmth, air, food, and sleep. What changed was the density and permanence of those needs. The smoke did not belong to a temporary campfire that might vanish with the next movement across the land. It belonged to a room that would be used again. The wall did not simply break the wind for a night. It stood beside other walls repaired over time. The roof did not merely cover a shelter. It became a surface that other bodies could cross. In such a place, the human body was surrounded by traces of staying. This would have shaped posture, attention, and habit. A person might squat or sit near the floor, work close to the hearth, lift stored materials, climb to the roof, carry fuel or food down a ladder, and move carefully around the opening above. These actions are ordinary, but they make a different kind of body-world relationship from the one taught by modern streets. Modern movement often allows distance. A sidewalk between houses, a road between neighbours, a doorway separating inside from outside. Here, nearness was built into the environment. Walls stood close, roofs connected. Smoke, sound, warmth, and smell could cross boundaries that modern architecture tries to control more sharply. None of this should be turned into a false claim that life was either healthier, worse, happier, or more fearful than ours. The evidence does not allow such simple judgment, but it does allow a quieter understanding. A city without streets was also a city where the body met space vertically, closely, and sensually. Eyes adjusted from roof light to room shadow. Lungs lived near hearth smoke. Feet learned raised earth surfaces. Hands learned ladders and plastered walls. Skin learned the difference between exposed roof air and enclosed domestic warmth. The ancient settlement was not only a plan of houses, it was a place that trained human senses to live between sky and room, between the old outdoor body and the new settled interior. A modern street teaches the body to feel separate. Even before we think about it, a sidewalk tells us where movement belongs. A door tells us where private life begins. A wall, a fence, a curb, or a road gives distance between one household and another. The body can pass strangers without touching their homes. It can leave a room, enter a public path, and move through a city while remaining outside the lives behind the walls. This is one of the quiet habits of modern urban life. Distance is built into the plan. But in the ancient roof-entered settlement, the body seems to have lived inside a different lesson. There, movement did not unfold along streets between buildings. It moved over the buildings themselves. The route home may have crossed the surfaces that covered other rooms. The threshold did not face outward into a lane. It opened downward into the house. This means the difference was not only architectural, it was biological, sensory, and social. A modern body often walks through cities as if space is divided into clear layers: street, building, room, roof, inside, outside. In the roof-entered settlement, these layers were closer, softer, and more entangled. The roof could be outside, but it also belonged to the house. The opening could bring light and air, but it was also the doorway. The ladder could be furniture, path, and boundary at the same time. The room below could be private, yet the surface above might carry the feet of others. Such a world would train attention differently. A person would not only look ahead, as on a road, they would look down into openings, across roof edges, toward ladders, smoke, neighbouring surfaces, and the places where one household's upper space touched another's. This is where the ancient body and the modern body begin to feel far apart, though they belong to the same species. Our ancestors began in landscapes where movement was flexible. The body crossed uneven ground, avoided danger, carried food, watched weather, followed memory, and adjusted to surfaces that changed with season and place. Modern streets remove much of that uncertainty. They flatten movement, they guide the feet, they create repeated public routes that many strangers can share without needing deep knowledge of one another's homes. The roof-entered settlement did something different. It took the older human ability to climb, balance, bend, carry, and adjust, then placed it inside a permanent community. The result was not wild movement and not modern walking, but a quieter middle form, an ancient moving body learning to live in a dense built world. This difference also changes the meaning of privacy. In a street-based city, the front door is a clear symbol. It faces the public path and marks a boundary. In a roof-entered house, the boundary was more vertical. To enter, a person descended. To leave, a person rose. Daily life may have felt less like stepping out onto a street and more like emerging from an interior into a shared upper surface. That movement carries a different emotional shape, but we must be careful not to invent feelings we cannot prove. The safer point is physical. The body's route between home and community was organized through height, nearness, and roof access rather than through ground-level streets. This one fact is enough to change the way we imagine early settlement. It shows that human beings did not immediately solve crowded life by creating the familiar distance of roads. In one ancient place, they solved it by accepting closeness. They lived wall to wall. They moved above rooms. They entered from the roof. They allowed the home, the path, and the sky to meet in one vertical arrangement. A modern street gives the body a corridor through the city. The roof-entered settlement gave the body a surface over the home. And in that difference, we can feel the deep history of how humans slowly changed from creatures of open ground into people who could live within walls, beneath paths, and beside neighbours close enough for the settlement itself to become a shared human skin. What remains after 9,000 years is never the whole life of a place. It is only what time could not fully erase. In the roof-entered settlement, the strongest witnesses are not voices, names, arguments, meals, or private thoughts. They are walls, floors, hearths, plaster, buried layers, tools, bones, traces of fire, and the repeated outlines of houses pressed close together. These remains are quiet, but they are not empty. A wall tells us that someone shaped earth into a boundary. A floor tells us that bodies return to the same surface again and again. A hearth tells us that fire was held in a particular place. A ladder scar, an opening, or the structure of a room can suggest how people entered, moved, breathed, and lived. Archaeology begins with such traces. It does not begin with certainty about what people believed, feared, loved, or intended. That is why a streetless city must be approached slowly. The ground can show that houses were dense. It can show that many entrances were likely from above. It can show that the settlement did not depend on streets in the familiar later sense. But the ground cannot simply hand us a complete human day. It gives fragments, and those fragments must be treated with patience. This patience matters because ancient places are easy to turn into stories that are too neat. A buried house can become a symbol too quickly. A roof opening can become a dramatic secret. A strange plan can be made to sound like a lost civilization with a single hidden answer. But the more useful truth is quieter. The settlement is powerful because it leaves enough evidence to challenge modern assumptions, while still leaving enough silence to keep us humble. When archaeologists uncover plastered floors, they are not only finding surfaces, they are finding repeated care. When they identify hearths and ovens, they are seeing where heat, food, smoke, and daily routine gathered. When they study walls built close to other walls, they are seeing how space was organized without open streets. When they find later building layers above earlier ones, they are seeing that people did not merely arrive, live once, and vanish. They returned to the same ground, rebuilt on it, covered it, repaired it, and allowed life to accumulate vertically. This connects deeply with the beginning of settled human life. For most of our species' history, traces were lighter. A temporary camp might leave stone tools, bones, ash, or stains in the earth, but many gestures of life vanished almost immediately. A shelter of branches could decay. A path through grass could close. A memory could travel with people and leave no mark in soil. In a dense settlement, human life became heavier in the ground. Walls stayed, floors layered, fireplaces marked repeated use. The human body, once moving across landscapes, began to press its routines into one place. That is what archaeology can read best. Not a perfect story, but the pressure of repeated action. A room repaired many times suggests return. A hearth used again suggests habit. A house built beside another house suggests density. A roof route suggested by entrances from above suggests a different way of connecting homes. None of these traces needs exaggeration to be meaningful. In fact, exaggeration would make them weaker. The real mystery is not that people were impossibly strange. The real mystery is that ordinary human needs produced a world that feels strange to us now. They needed warmth, food, sleep, storage, air, and social closeness, as humans always have. Yet the material answer took a form very unlike the streets and doors we expect. This is where responsible imagination begins. We can imagine a person descending into a room because the architecture points in that direction. We can imagine smoke rising because hearths and roof openings make that relationship likely. We can imagine dense nearness because the walls themselves preserve it. But we should not invent exact conversations, fixed rituals, or secret motives when the evidence does not require them. The buried settlement teaches us two lessons at once. It shows how far from our habits early settled life could be, and it shows how much of the past remains beyond our reach. What we have are the durable remains of mud, fire, floor, wall, roof, and repair. What we do not have is the full inner life of the people who moved through them. Between those two truths, the city with no streets becomes more honest, more mysterious, and more human. The most difficult thing about an ancient settlement is not what remains, but what has disappeared without leaving a clear mark. Walls can survive as lines in the ground. Floors can remain as hard surfaces. Hearths can leave ash, stain, and heat-altered earth. Burials, tools, fragments of plaster, animal bones, and plant traces can help rebuild parts of daily life. But a living community was made from more than things. It was made from voices, pauses, gestures, smells that changed by season, small habits of care, warnings given to children, repeated ways of carrying food, rules that may never have been written, and meanings that may have been understood without anyone needing to explain them. These are the parts of the roof-entered settlement that are hardest to recover. The archaeology can show that people likely entered many homes from above, but it cannot fully restore the feeling of a foot reaching the top of a ladder at night. It can show dense houses, but it cannot tell us every rule people used when crossing one another's roof surfaces. It can show hearths, but it cannot replay the exact sound of cooking, coughing, conversation, silence, or sleep in a room where smoke rose toward the opening above. This is why the streetless city must be treated with restraint. The lost material is not empty, it is simply beyond direct recovery. For most of human history, life was carried in bodies more than in permanent structures. A look could tell a child where not to step. A repeated hand movement could teach how to repair a surface. A season could teach when fuel was scarce. A family habit could decide where objects belonged inside a room. These things may have shaped daily life as much as walls did, yet they rarely survive with names attached. When humans began to live in dense settlements, the old moving body brought many invisible traditions into a more permanent world. People did not arrive as blank minds waiting for architecture to teach them everything. They brought inherited ways of sharing space, raising children, handling food, using fire, noticing danger, and remembering those who came before. Some of those habits may have changed because of the new built environment. Some may have continued from older mobile lives. The evidence cannot sort every thread. It can only show where repeated action touched the earth hard enough to remain. This makes the absence of streets even more interesting. A modern viewer may ask too quickly, how did they organize life without roads? But the answer may not have been a single formal plan. It may have lived in habits that left few traces, where people stepped, which roof edges were familiar, how households recognized boundaries, when certain openings were used, how smoke and work shaped movement, how children learned the safe routes, and how neighbors understood closeness. These social patterns could have been real even if they were never carved into streets. A street is a visible organizer of movement. A habit is quieter. It can guide a whole community and then vanish almost completely. That is the cold truth about early human settlement. Some of the most important structures were not made of mudbrick at all. They were made of repetition. They lived in memory, posture, timing, trust, avoidance, and shared understanding. Archaeology can approach those structures only indirectly. It can infer from where, layout, access, and repair, but it cannot turn inference into certainty. In a sleep audio about this place, that uncertainty is not a weakness. It is part of the value. It reminds us that the people who lived there were not characters in a simple mystery. They were human beings whose ordinary life was far richer than what the ground can preserve. The city without streets left enough behind to show a strange and careful arrangement of space. It did not leave enough to let us own its full meaning. Between the surviving walls and the missing voices, the settlement becomes more honest. It teaches that the past is not silent because nothing happened there. It is silent because so much human life was made of things too soft to last. A mystery from deep history becomes weaker when it is forced to give a simple answer. The roof-entered settlement is powerful because it stands between what can be seen and what cannot be recovered. Its houses were real. Its dense walls were real. Its roof access was not invented for drama. Its lack of familiar streets is not a modern fantasy. Yet the full reason behind that arrangement cannot be reduced to one clean explanation without losing honesty. Perhaps the layout grew from practical building habits. Perhaps the materials made tight construction easier. Perhaps the roofs offered useful movement in a crowded place. Perhaps social custom, climate, repair, storage, and generations of repetition all worked together until the settlement took a shape that now feels strange to us. The safest truth is not one hidden cause, but the convergence of many ordinary pressures. This is how ancient life often works. It does not always leave behind a single reason. It leaves behind a pattern. A wall close to another wall, a floor renewed many times, a hearth placed where smoke needed escape, a roof opening connecting air, fire, and entry, a house built over older traces. These pieces do not speak like a confession. They speak like weathered evidence. They ask for interpretation, but they also ask for restraint. For most of human existence, our ancestors solved problems without leaving written explanations. They adapted through habit, memory, shared skill, and repeated use of available materials. A group did not need to announce a theory of architecture in order to build a workable shelter. A community did not need to write a plan for every path in order to move through a dense settlement. Much of human life is organized before it is ever described. That is why a responsible story about this place should not pretend that mystery means emptiness. It should mean that the evidence has edges. We can walk up to those edges, but we should not step beyond them as if imagination were the same as proof. There is still enough wonder inside the careful version. In fact, the careful version is more beautiful. It lets the ancient settlement remain human rather than turning it into a puzzle box. The people who lived there were not symbols created to surprise us. They were bodies with hunger, fatigue, warmth, fear, skill, children, work, memory, and the need to sleep safely through the night. Their world may look strange because the arrangement of space was different, but the needs beneath it were familiar. That is the bridge between them and us. We do not need to invent secret motives to feel the distance. The distance is already present in the roof above the room, the ladder descending into shadow, the wall pressed beside another wall, and the missing street where our minds expect one to be. A good historical mystery should not close too quickly. It should leave room for the silence of the past. It should let archaeology do what archaeology can do: show material traces, compare patterns, test ideas, revise older assumptions, and remind us when evidence is uncertain. It should also let the unknown remain unknown when the ground does not speak clearly enough. The roof-entered settlement teaches that human history is not a straight hallway lit from end to end. It is more like a series of rooms reached through openings we can only partly see. Some rooms are bright with evidence, others are dim, and we enter them carefully. If we move too fast, we fill the darkness with our own voices. If we move slowly, the silence itself becomes part of the lesson. The city with no streets does not need a false final answer to matter. It matters because it shows that early humans could organize closeness in ways our modern habits almost forgot. A child born inside this roof-entered settlement would have entered a world that did not need streets in order to feel complete. To that child, a ladder leading upward may have seemed as ordinary as a front door seems to us. A roof surface under the open sky may have been one of the first outdoor places the body learned. The edges of openings, the warmth of hearths below, the smell of plaster and smoke, the closeness of neighbouring walls and the pattern of houses pressed tightly together could have formed the earliest map of life. This matters because human settlement is not only built by adults who choose materials and repair walls, it is also rebuilt inside the senses of children. What one generation invents or accepts, the next generation may experience as normal. A person born there may not have felt that streets were missing. The absence would be ours, not necessarily theirs. We are the ones who arrive late, carrying the shape of later cities in our minds. They were born into a different arrangement, where the world above the house connected people, and the world below the roof held fire, sleep, storage, and memory. This is one of the quiet ways a settlement becomes a culture. It teaches the body before it teaches the mind. A child learns where not to step, where smoke rises, where a ladder stands, where light enters, where food is kept, and how close another household can be without becoming unfamiliar. These lessons do not need writing. They are repeated in the body until they feel natural. In the deep beginning of humanity, children learned landscapes in similar ways, but the landscape was wider and less fixed. A child in a mobile group might learn river bends, animal trails, useful plants, dangerous ground, seasonal camps, and the movements of older people across open land. Memory was spread across distance. In a dense settlement, memory began to settle into surfaces. The roof edge, the wall, the hearth, the ladder, the packed floor, and the familiar opening became part of childhood itself. This was not a small change. It meant that human identity could begin to grow from a place that remained, rather than only from a root that moved. Yet nothing about this should be made too certain or too romantic. We cannot know exactly how children felt, how they played, what they feared, or what stories they were told, but we can safely understand that a built environment shapes early experience. A child raised among roof entrances would not learn space in the same way as a child raised on streets. The first sense of neighbour might not be someone across a lane, but someone whose roofline, wall, smoke, or household opening was close by. The first sense of outside might not be a road, but a raised surface under light. The first act of coming home might involve descent. The settlement also reminds us that generations do not simply pass through architecture. They change it, wear it, repair it, and inherit it. Children become adults. Adults replaster walls. Floors are renewed. Houses are modified, closed, rebuilt, and built over. The places that once seemed fixed to a child may later become surfaces that same person repairs with their own hands. In this way, a roof-entered community was not only a collection of houses at one moment, it was a chain of bodies learning the same unusual space across time. The old human body, once trained by open land and movement, was now teaching its young to know an enclosed and elevated world. A settlement without streets could last only if people learned it deeply enough to make it ordinary. Perhaps that is the most important point. The city without streets was not just a plan seen from above. It was a childhood, a habit, a set of repeated motions, and a way of becoming human in a place where home was entered from the roof. A settlement that is rebuilt again and again does not keep time the way a modern street map does. On a modern map, a road may stay visible for centuries, even as buildings change around it. The road becomes the line of memory. People say one house stood on this side, another stood on that corner, and the street itself holds the shape of the place. In the ancient roof-entered settlement, memory seems to have worked more vertically. Houses were built, used, repaired, filled, covered, and sometimes built over. The ground did not simply hold one life and then clear itself for another. It thickened. Each floor belonged to a moment of use, but also rested above older traces. Each wall belonged to a house, but also stood inside a longer history of building and rebuilding. This makes the settlement feel less like a flat plan and more like a deep human layer. A person living there may have known only the surface of their own time. the floor beneath their feet, the walls around their room, the roof above their head. But below that present surface were earlier decisions, earlier repairs, earlier fires, earlier bodies, earlier meals, earlier sleepers, and older forms of the same human need to remain. This is one of the quiet transformations that happens when mobile human life becomes settled. In a moving world, memory often stretches across distance. A group remembers a water source, a hunting place, a patch of plants, a safer crossing, a ridge where wind changes, a camp used in a certain season. The land is remembered as a sequence of returns, but in a dense settlement, memory begins to stack. Instead of moving from place to place across a wide landscape, people return to the same ground until the ground becomes full of human time. A wall can be replastered many times. A floor can be renewed over older flooring. A room can change use. A house can be closed, altered, or built over. The same place becomes many places, one above another. This gives the streetless settlement a special kind of depth. The absence of streets does not mean the absence of order. It may mean that order was held through houses, surfaces, roofs, and inherited patterns, rather than through open corridors carved through the ground. A child could grow up on a floor that already covered older life. An adult could repair a wall whose position had been shaped by earlier building. A roof route could pass over rooms that were part of a long chain of domestic renewal. The settlement was not only occupied, it was accumulated. That accumulation also changes how we think about disappearance. When people leave a modern street, the road may remain as a visible skeleton. When people leave a settlement of packed earthen houses, time works differently. Walls collapse, roofs decay, openings fill, wind and soil soften the edges. What was once a lived surface becomes buried structure. Yet burial is not the same as erasure. In some ways, burial preserves the very thing that daily life eventually left behind. The old houses become readable because they were covered. The floors survive because they were sealed. The traces of fire, plaster, storage, and rebuilding remain because later layers protected earlier ones. This is why archaeology can see time there not only as a date, but as a thickness. Still, we should not turn the layers into a false story of perfect continuity. We cannot know that every generation understood the houses in the same way. We cannot know whether every rebuilding carried the same meaning. Communities change slowly and unevenly. Habits can continue after their first reason is forgotten. A wall can be rebuilt because it works, because others built it there before, because space is limited, because materials are familiar, or because a household expects the settlement to feel a certain way. The safest reading is that repeated construction created a bond between people and place that was much deeper than a temporary camp. The old human body, once trained to carry memory across open land, was now living above memory held in earth. Feet crossed, new floors laid over older floors, fires burned above older fires, roofs connected rooms that belonged to the latest surface of a much deeper settlement. In that slow stacking of homes, the city without streets became a record of generations learning to stay. A community does not need familiar streets in order to endure. It needs ways for people to return, repair, recognize, and repeat. That may be the quiet lesson of the roof-entered settlement after many generations on the same ground. From a modern distance, we look for the signs later cities trained us to expect. Roads, public squares, gates, and open corridors between buildings. When those signs are absent, it is easy to assume that something essential was missing, but endurance can be organized through other means. A dense settlement of houses, roofs, ladders, hearths, storage spaces, and remembered surfaces could hold people together without becoming a city in the later street-based sense. Its order may not have been drawn as lines through open ground. It may have lived in repeated contact between houses, in roof roots, wall repair, openings, and the way each generation learned the same raised and enclosed world. This helps us see the settlement not as a failed version of the modern city, but as a human answer to a different historical problem. The problem was not how to build avenues. The problem was how to remain. For most of our species' deep beginning, remaining was not the default answer. Movement had been a form of intelligence. To move was to follow food, find water, respond to seasons, avoid exhausted places, and keep the group alive when conditions changed. A settlement like this did not erase that ancient inheritance, it redirected it. The old skills of attention, memory, carrying, balance, and repair were pulled into a fixed place. People still had to know the surrounding land, but the house became a center they returned to again and again. The roof became a route. The ladder became a threshold. The floor became a record of use. The wall became both separation and connection. These ordinary features could create a stable community without streets. A modern street makes order visible. It lets a stranger understand the shape of a place quickly, but an older settlement may have been legible mainly to those who lived inside it. Its order may have been learned through childhood, work, household practice, and repeated movement. A person from outside might have seen a crowded mass of mudbrick and roof openings. A person born there may have seen roots, boundaries, familiar households, safe crossings, smoky interiors, and known descents into home. Human space is not only what can be measured, it is also what can be learned. The settlement could continue because its pattern was taught from body to body, not only from wall to wall. Children watched older people move. Adults repaired surfaces they had crossed as children. Homes changed, but roof access could persist. Rooms were altered, but entering downward could remain familiar. Continuity did not require monumental planning. It could arise from practical repetition. Still, we should not imagine an unchanging world. No ancient community stands outside time. Households may have changed. Some customs may have faded while others remained. The settlement's form could have adapted gradually, without leaving us a clear explanation for each change. That uncertainty is important because it keeps the past human. People did not live as examples in a museum. They responded to wear, need, birth, weather, food, material limits, and the pressure of neighbours nearby. The absence of streets did not freeze them in mystery. It simply shows that their community did not depend on later urban forms. A place can be long-lived because enough people know how to use it, care for it, and pass its habits forward. In the roof-entered settlement, endurance may have been carried by mud-brick walls and human memory together. The houses held bodies. The roofs held movement. The layers below held time. And through all of it, one early community reminds us that the history of cities is not only the history of roads, but also the history of humans learning how to stay close without yet building the streets that would later define closeness for us. The question of why there were no familiar streets cannot be answered by one reason alone. A settlement is not a machine designed from a single idea. It grows from materials, habits, needs, limits, and repeated choices that may have begun before anyone thought of them as a plan. In the roof-entered community of central Anatolia, the houses were placed very close together, sometimes so close that open lanes between them did not become the main structure of movement. This density may have saved space, but space was not just an empty measurement. It was food, fuel, clay, work, bodies, children, storage, warmth, and the pressure of many lives, trying to remain near one another. When houses stand apart, the ground between them can become paths. When houses press together, the roofs can become the paths instead. This does not prove that saving space was the only reason. It only shows that dense building and roof movement fit together in a practical way. The settlement may have grown like a cluster of rooms rather than like a grid of roads. One house added near another, one wall repaired beside another wall, one roof surface connected to the next. Over time, the spaces that a later city might have opened into streets could have been absorbed into domestic architecture. This reaches back to the deep human beginning, when space was not owned by buildings but negotiated through movement. For mobile ancestors, distance could solve many problems. If a camp became crowded, if fuel was harder to find, if waste built up, or if food shifted elsewhere, people could move. Their world was wide, and the body was trained to use that width. A settled community had less of that freedom. It had to solve pressure by arranging matter more carefully. Walls, floors, roofs, and storage places became ways of holding life in place. In such a world, building close may have offered several quiet advantages. Close walls could reduce exposed surfaces. Shared proximity could make repair, communication, and movement across roofs easier. A compact settlement might also preserve warmth better than scattered houses, though we should not turn that into a certainty. What matters is the pattern. When people live densely, the boundary between architecture and social life becomes thinner. The layout itself begins to teach people how to stay. The absence of streets may also reflect the fact that early settled communities did not yet need the same kinds of circulation as later cities. A street is useful when many strangers, animals, carts, markets, workshops, officials, and goods must pass through a place in regular ways. But this ancient settlement belonged to a different stage of human gathering. It was not a later city with wheeled traffic, monumental avenues, written administration, and large open public routes. Its daily life may have been organized more around households, roofs, shared habits, and repeated local knowledge. The people who lived there did not need a visitor from the future to understand the layout. They learned it from within. A roof route could be known because it was crossed many times. A boundary could be respected because it was taught by habit. A ladder could mark a home more clearly than a front door marks ours. This is why the idea of space saving should be handled carefully. It is not only about fitting more buildings into less land. It is about how an early settled population managed nearness before streets became the obvious answer. The compact form may have helped people remain together while still preserving many small domestic centres. Each house kept its hearth, storage, floor, and entrance. The roofs linked them without carving wide corridors through the ground. In that sense, density did not erase the home. It multiplied homes until the spaces between them became roof, wall, and memory. The city without streets may therefore reflect a simple but profound trade. Less open ground between houses, more connected surface above them. Fewer side entrances, more downward thresholds. Less visible street order, more learned domestic order. It was not a mistake waiting to become a modern city. It was one early human solution to the pressure of staying close. A roof that carries footsteps is not only a roof. In a street-based city, the path usually belongs to the ground, while the roof belongs to shelter. The two ideas stay apart. But in the ancient roof-entered settlement, the upper surface of the house may have carried a strange double meaning. It protected the room below, yet also helped connect one home to another. It was linked to a household, but it may also have belonged to the wider movement of the community. This makes the roof a difficult space for the modern mind. Was it private, because it sat above a home? Was it shared, because people crossed it? Was it a working place, an entrance, a surface for air and light, or a boundary between families? The most careful answer is that it may have been several of these things at once. Early settled life often did not divide space into the clean categories that later cities made familiar. A single surface could do many jobs because the whole settlement was built from practical need, repeated habit, and available materials. The roof could be a path, but not like a road with clear public ownership. It could be a threshold, but not like a front door opening onto a street. It could be part of a home, yet also part of the settlement's circulation. That mixture may be one reason the city without streets worked at all. Movement did not disappear. It became woven into the upper layer of domestic architecture. A person crossing a roof was moving through the community while remaining close to the houses themselves. Beneath the feet were rooms where people cooked, stored, slept, repaired, and remembered. Above the head was the open sky. Between the two was the human body, balancing inside a world where public and private were not separated by a road, but by height, habit, and trust. This has deep roots in human beginnings. Before permanent settlement, many boundaries were flexible. A camp edge might be understood by those who lived there, even if it was not marked by a wall. A sleeping place, a hearth, a tool area, or a place for food preparation could be recognized through repeated use. Human beings did not need written signs to know how to behave around shared space. They learned through observation, correction, custom, and memory. In the roof-entered settlement, that older ability may have been carried into a denser built world. Roofs may have required shared understanding. People would need to know where to step, where openings were, which areas were familiar, which surfaces needed care, and how to move without disturbing the fragile balance between household life below and movement above. None of this can be described with total certainty. The evidence gives us the architecture, not the complete social rules. But the architecture itself points toward a community where space was learned from inside, not simply planned from above. A roof route could be both ordinary and meaningful because people grew up inside its logic. A ladder could mark a boundary without needing a street. A roof opening could connect a household to the wider settlement, without turning the home outward. In later cities, streets often create public life by opening space between buildings. Here, the roof may have created connection by placing movement on top of buildings. That difference changes the meaning of nearness. Neighbours were not only across from one another, they were beside one another, under one another's lines of movement, and joined by surfaces that had to be maintained. The settlement's social order may have depended less on visible separation and more on repeated familiarity. To street tells strangers where to walk. A roof world may depend more on people already knowing the place. This may be one quiet possibility behind the absence of streets. The community did not need open roads everywhere because roofs, ladders, openings, and learned boundaries could carry enough of daily movement. The city without streets was not empty of shared space. Its shared space may have been raised above the rooms, spread across the tops of homes, and held together by the same old human skill that once guided camps, paths, and remembered landscapes. The ability to know where one may move because the body has learned the place. The absence of streets may tempt the mind toward one final explanation, but the older human world rarely gives itself in that way. A dense settlement entered from the roof was not the result of only one need, one fear, one clever invention, or one fixed rule. It was more likely the product of many quiet pressures working together over time. Mudbrick made certain forms possible. Flat roofs made movement above the rooms practical enough to become familiar. Close houses saved open space, and may have helped maintain a compact community. Hearths, storage areas, plastered floors, ladders, and roof openings all shaped the way people returned home. Social habits may have guided where people stepped and how they understood boundaries. Climate, repair, fuel, food, family memory, and the slow growth of the settlement all belong to the same pattern. None of these traces alone can answer the title completely. Together, they show that the city without streets was not a puzzle with one hidden key. It was an arrangement of life. This is important because modern people often look at ancient settlements as if someone first drew a plan and then forced everyone to live inside it. But much early human building probably grew from repetition. A wall worked, so a wall was repaired. A roof carried movement, so feet crossed it again. A house stood near another, so the next house adjusted to that closeness. An opening gave light, air, smoke, escape, and entry, so that vertical route became part of ordinary life. Over generations, practical acts can become tradition without needing a single origin story. This reaches back to the beginning of human adaptation. Our ancestors survived not because they always invented perfect systems in advance, but because they adjusted, remembered, copied, tested, and repeated what worked well enough. A camp could grow around a fire because bodies gathered there. A path could form because feet returned to the same safe crossing. A shelter form could persist because it protected people through enough nights. In a settled community, the same human tendency became heavier in the ground. Repetition hardened into architecture. Habit became layout. Memory became a roof route, a ladder, a floor, a wall, a descent into home. The mystery of the missing streets is therefore not solved by saying the people wanted defense, or warmth, or density, or ritual, or convenience alone. Any one of those answers is too narrow. The physical remains suggest several possibilities at once, and the honest story must let them overlap. A compact plan may have reduced open gaps between houses. Roofs may have created usable shared surfaces. Entry from above may have helped combine movement, light, ventilation, and domestic boundaries. The house-centered arrangement may have reflected a community where household life carried more weight than ground-level public streets. Yet, each of these points is a careful possibility, not a complete confession from the past. The people did not leave a written explanation telling us why the settlement took this form. What they left was a built pattern, and a built pattern can be meaningful without being fully translated. Perhaps that is the deepest value of this ancient place. It does not simply tell us that humans once built differently. It reminds us that humans could live differently. Before later cities trained people to think in streets, addresses, doors, and public roads, one early community shaped closeness through roofs, rooms, openings, and learned movement. The result was not a lesser city waiting to become modern. It was one branch in the long history of settlement, shaped by bodies still close to their mobile past, yet already learning the weight of staying. The city with no streets remains powerful because it does not close into certainty. It stays open, like a roof opening above a dark room, letting light enter without revealing everything below. The strange thing about a city without streets is that it makes our own cities feel less natural. We walk through modern life as if streets have always been the obvious bones of human community. Roads divide blocks, addresses belong to streets, doors face outward. Shops, homes, schools and meeting places are arranged around lines of movement that seem so ordinary we hardly notice them. But the ancient roof-entered settlement asks us to step outside that habit. It reminds us that the city, before it became a street map, may have been something more intimate and more difficult to recognize. Many homes pressed together, many fires held under roofs, many bodies learning how to stay close without the open corridors we now expect. The modern city teaches us to look for public life outside the house. We imagine community beginning in the road, the square, the market, or the visible path between buildings. Yet this older settlement suggests another beginning, where community may have grown from domestic life itself. The house was not a private box added to a public grid. The house was the basic cell of the settlement. Its roof became part of movement. Its opening became the threshold. Its floor held repeated life. Its walls touched or approached other walls until the settlement became dense enough to feel like a single human-made surface. That kind of place is easy to misunderstand because it does not match the shapes that later history made famous. We remember cities with walls, gates, temples, palaces, streets, and written records. We forget that before those forms, human beings were still learning how to gather many lives into one place. This learning began from older needs, not from urban theory. Our ancestors first needed warmth, food, shelter, sleep, protection from weather, and some way to remain together through uncertainty. For most of human existence, those needs were met in smaller, more mobile worlds. The land itself was the wide structure. Paths followed water, animals, seasons, and memory. A roof-entered settlement marks a quieter transformation, where human life began to thicken in one location. The open path did not vanish from human nature, but it was reshaped. Movement rose above houses. Memory sank into floors, fire stayed in rooms, food waited in storage. Children learned a home that did not open onto a street. In this sense, the lost city before streets is not a lost empire or a dramatic ruin. It is a lost way of arranging nearness. Modern cities often protect us from the closeness they create. Streets give space between homes, doors define boundaries, roads let strangers move past one another without entering domestic worlds. In the ancient settlement, the relationship may have been more compressed. The route across the roof passed near the life below. The entrance led down into an interior. The shared surface and the private room were separated not by a street, but by height, habit, and a roof opening. This does not mean life there was better or worse. It means it was organized through another logic. The lesson is not to romanticize the past, but to let the past loosen our certainty. If an early community could become dense without familiar streets, then the city is not one fixed invention. It is a long human experiment in staying together. Some forms became dominant and familiar. Others disappeared under earth, preserved only as walls, floors, hearths, and openings. The roof-entered settlement belongs to those buried possibilities. It shows that humans once solved the problem of closeness by building upward into the roof and downward into the home, before later generations spread movement across roads and streets. To remember that is to see our own world more gently. The street outside the door is not the only possible beginning of community. It is one answer among many, and some of the earliest answers were made from mud, ladders, smoke, roofs, and the patient need to remain near one another. The value of this ancient settlement is not that it gives us a dramatic secret, but that it teaches a slower kind of honesty. It asks us not to use the present as a ruler for measuring the past too quickly. A modern person may look at houses without streets and think something is missing. No front doors, no lanes, no clear public road, no familiar plan. But that reaction tells us as much about ourselves as it tells us about the ancient community. We have inherited a world where streets organize memory, movement, property, trade, and identity. We are trained to feel that a city becomes understandable only when it can be entered through roads and named by addresses. The roof-entered settlement quietly resists that habit. It tells us that human beings once arranged crowded life through another set of relations: roof to room, ladder to floor, hearth to opening, wall to wall, household to household, and present surface to buried past. To understand such a place, we have to loosen the grip of modern certainty. That does not mean believing anything we want. It means doing the opposite. It means staying close to the evidence while allowing the ancient world to remain different from ours. Archaeology can show us dense houses, plastered floors, hearths, roof access, storage traces, burials in some domestic contexts, and layers of rebuilding. These are enough to reshape the imagination. They do not need to be turned into fantasy. The educational lesson is that real history often becomes more powerful when it is not forced into a simple answer. We can say that the settlement had no streets in the familiar later sense, but we should not say that its people had no order. We can say they entered many homes from above, but we should not pretend to know every rule, feeling, or meaning attached to that movement. We can say their houses were central to life, but we should not make them symbols of a single belief unless the evidence allows it. This carefulness matters because the people of the deep past were not incomplete versions of us. They were complete humans living inside different conditions. Their bodies needed warmth, food, sleep, air, safety, and social connection, as ours do. But the material world around those needs was different. Their built answers were shaped by earth, fire, roof, ladder, repair, and long repetition. In the deep beginning of our species, humans survived by adapting to landscapes. Later, in settlements like this, they began adapting to landscapes they had partly made themselves. That shift is one of the great, quiet changes in human history. A wall is not only protection, it also creates nearness. A roof is not only shelter, it can become a path. A floor is not only a surface, it can become a record of return. A house is not only a room, it can become a centre where generations gather, leave traces, and are covered by time. When we look at the ancient settlement with this patience, we gain something more useful than surprise. We gain humility. We remember that our own way of living is not the final shape of human life. Streets, doors, sidewalks, and addresses feel natural because they surround us, but they are historical arrangements too. They came from particular needs, technologies, populations, and habits. The roof-entered settlement reminds us that other arrangements were once possible, and some were lived long enough to become ordinary to those born inside them. That is the lesson worth carrying forward. The past does not need to be made louder to be meaningful. Sometimes it teaches best by showing a quiet difference. A community without familiar streets, a home entered from above, and a human world that asks us to see our own assumptions from the roof of another age. When the last wall falls silent and the last roof opening fills with earth, a settlement does not disappear all at once. It changes form. A place once entered by ladders becomes a pattern in the ground. A roof once crossed by feet becomes a buried trace. A room once warmed by fire becomes a layer of ash, plaster, bone, soil, and memory. The people are gone, the voices are gone, the daily rules are gone, but the arrangement they left behind still asks a question that is larger than one ancient settlement. What makes a city a city? Is it streets, gates, markets, rulers, walls, monuments, and written names? Or can it begin earlier, in a quieter form, when many human lives gather close enough that houses touch, roofs connect, and the act of entering home means descending from the sky-facing surface into the room below? This question matters because it changes how we understand human history. We often imagine civilization as something that appears when life becomes visible in the ways we already recognize. Roads make sense to us, doorways make sense to us, addresses, neighborhoods, and public spaces make sense to us. But the deep past did not exist to prepare the world for our habits. It moved through its own experiments. Some of those experiments became foundations for later life. Others remained local, fragile, or eventually abandoned. Some were buried so completely that only careful excavation could bring them back into thought. The roof-entered settlement belongs to this quieter inheritance. It shows that humans were learning to live densely before the familiar language of streets became dominant. They were not simply waiting for the modern city to arrive. They were already solving older problems with the materials and habits available to them: how to keep fire, how to store food, how to sleep under cover, how to raise children near other households, how to move through a crowded place, how to repair what weather and use damaged, and how to remain on the same ground long enough for life to leave layers. These were not small questions. They came from the oldest human needs, carried forward from the time when our ancestors crossed open land in small groups. The moving body became a settled body slowly. It did not lose its ancient skills in one moment. It brought balance, memory, caution, carrying, climbing, and adaptation into a new-built world. In that world, the path could be a roof. The threshold could be a hole above the room. The house could be both shelter and center. The floor could hold not only weight, but time. This is the educational value of the mystery. It teaches us that human life has never had only one correct shape. We should not look at the past and ask only why it failed to look like us. We should ask what pressures, materials, bodies, and memories made another arrangement possible. The city without streets was not proof that ancient people were unknowable, nor proof that they held a secret we have lost completely. It was proof of something more modest and more profound. Human beings can make community in ways that later generations may struggle to imagine. A roof can become a road. A room can become a world. A cluster of homes can become a settlement without first becoming a street map. The final lesson is not to close the mystery, but to carry it gently. The past gives us enough evidence to learn and enough silence to remain humble. It reminds us that our own streets, doors, and cities are not the only possible answers to being human together. They are one answer, made by time, need, and habit, just as that ancient roof-entered settlement was another answer, made from mudbrick, smoke, ladders, walls, and the long patience of staying. And somewhere beneath the soil of central Anatolia, the same open question remains, whether a city is made by the streets people walk on or by the closeness they learn to live within.